The screams pierced the afternoon calm. Rick Coleman froze mid-step, his weathered hand gripping his walking stick as he spotted the horrifying sight. A massive dark cloud engulfing the student campsite ahead. Richard "Rick" Coleman, 67, had been enjoying his role as a volunteer advisor for this high school ecology trip. 25 students and 3 teachers had ventured into Montana wilderness for a 3-day camping expedition to study local ecosystems. As a retired Army Special Forces veteran, Rick appreciated how these trips connected young people with nature, though he rarely mentioned his military background. The distant screams quickly turned his leisurely perimeter check into a sprint. Despite his age, decades of military conditioning kept him fit as he raced toward the chaos. What he saw made even his combat-hardened nerves tighten. Millions of green bottleflies had descended on the camp in a bizarre swarm behavior, covering tents, equipment, and panicking students. "Get inside the tents. Cover your faces," a teacher shouted, but the flies were already infiltrating every space. Several students were frantically swatting at the air, while others were frozen in terror. Rick immediately recognized the limitations they faced. They were 4 hours from the nearest hospital. Self-service was spotty at best, and the single dirt road leading to their location crossed a stream that had risen with yesterday's rainfall. The few cans of insect repellent they brought were designed for mosquitoes, not a biblical plague of flies. As he pulled his bandana over his nose and mouth, Rick felt the familiar calm of combat assessment settling over him. This wasn't Afghanistan or Colombia, but the skills needed were the same: assess, adapt, overcome. Without revealing the full extent of his specialized training, Rick knew these kids needed more than just a camping guide now. Everyone gathered by the main fire pit. Rick's voice carried the unmistakable tone of command. Years of issuing orders in crisis situations made students and teachers alike respond instinctively. As the group huddled together, Rick conducted a rapid assessment. These weren't ordinary houseflies. The metallic green bodies and aggressive behavior identified them as green bottleflies, likely drawn by something in the area. But their numbers and coordinated swarming were unprecedented. "Mr. Coleman, Ellie can't breathe right," a panicked voice called out. A teenage girl was developing hives across her exposed skin, her breathing becoming labored. 2 other students showed similar symptoms, while a 4th was experiencing intense vomiting after accidentally inhaling several flies. The situation deteriorated rapidly. Ms. Peterson, the biology teacher, was frozen in shock, while Mr. Ramirez was trying to calm students despite his own obvious panic. The flies were increasing in number, now forming a buzzing cloud so thick it dimmed the sunlight. Rick tried the satellite phone, but could only leave a broken message with emergency services. Help would come eventually, but not soon enough. As he checked the girl's pulse, Rick's mind flashed back to a mission in Colombia 15 years ago. His team had encountered a similar phenomenon near a remote village, a rare convergence of environmental factors triggering mass insect behavior. The training kicked in automatically. "This is a biological response, not an attack," Rick explained calmly to the nearest teacher. "These flies are responding to something, possibly rotting material or specific chemicals. They're not aggressive by nature, but their numbers make them dangerous." Rick mentally inventoried their resources. The camp had 3 large tents, cooking supplies, first aid kits with antihistamines but no epinephrine, tarps, rope, and various tools. The surrounding forest offered pine resin, certain plants with insect repellent properties, and a small stream 50 yards east. The immediate challenges were clear. They needed to create protected spaces for the affected students, find a way to repel or redirect the swarm, and establish communication with emergency services, all while preventing panic among 24 teenagers. Rick noticed one student, a tall boy named Marcus, maintaining his composure. Have you done any first aid training?" "Yes, sir, Eagle Scout," Marcus replied. "Good. You're with me." Rick turned to Ms. Peterson. "I need you to snap out of it and help these kids. Can you do that?" His direct but calm approach seemed to reset her thinking, and she nodded. Rick didn't share that he was drawing on his biological warfare defense training, or that he'd seen what mass insect exposure could do to unprotected people. Instead, he projected confidence as he began organizing their response, knowing that panic would be as dangerous as the flies themselves. "We have everything we need to handle this," he assured them, though the situation was far more serious than he let on. "Now let's get to work." Rick's mind flashed to the specialized SEER training, survival, evasion, resistance, escape, he'd received decades ago. A week-long module on biological threats had covered everything from weaponized pathogens to natural phenomena like insect swarms. The instructor's words echoed. In nature's biological events, control the environment you can reach, not the one you can't. "We're implementing a 3-phase plan," Rick announced with a clarity that had once guided his teams through combat zones. "First, we create protected spaces. Second, we stabilize anyone having reactions. Third, we establish a safe evacuation route." Rick quickly organized the group into teams. "Marcus, take 3 people and gather all the tarps, rain gear, and trash bags. Ms. Peterson, identify anyone showing allergic symptoms and bring them to the main tent. Mr. Ramirez, I need the cooking supplies, specifically oil, vinegar, and baking soda." As the groups dispersed, Rick pulled out his pocket knife and headed to a nearby pine tree. Using techniques learned in jungle survival training, he quickly harvested resin, knowing its natural insect repellent properties. "Watch carefully," Rick demonstrated to 2 attentive students. "Mix the pine resin with cooking oil to create a barrier cream. Apply it to any exposed skin, but avoid eyes and mouth." This improvised repellent was something he'd learned from an indigenous guide during a mission in Southeast Asia. Meanwhile, Rick directed others to create a makeshift clean room using tarps and the natural slope of their campsite. "We're creating positive air pressure," he explained, using simple terms for a military environmental protection concept. "By placing the tarp opening downwind and keeping the small camping fan running, we push air out rather than letting flies in." For the students showing allergic reactions, Rick applied his combat medical training. Antihistamines first, he instructed Marcus, who was helping triage. Monitor their breathing patterns, look for intercostal retractions, or use of accessory muscles. When one student's reaction worsened, Rick improvised an epinephrine alternative using techniques from his field medicine training. "This is an old medic trick," he explained while preparing a solution of caffeine from their supplies. "Not as good as an EpiPen, but it can help until medical support arrives." Rick's Special Forces training in communication proved equally valuable. He established a clear command structure, used simple hand signals to reduce the need for shouting over the buzzing swarm, and implemented the military PACE plan, primary, alternate, contingency, emergency, for communication. Our primary communication is verbal. If separated, use these whistle patterns. He demonstrated 2 distinct patterns. If that fails, visual signals with the reflective emergency blankets. One of Rick's most valuable military skills was improvisation. When the flies began infiltrating one of the protective tarps, he quickly created a vinegar and baking soda mixture in pans placed strategically around the perimeter. "The carbon dioxide creates a barrier they don't like to cross," he explained, drawing on knowledge from both military training and his hobby of beekeeping. As the afternoon progressed, Rick continued applying military methodologies to their civilian crisis. He established a security perimeter with repellent barriers, created a centralized medical treatment area, and maintained regular situation reports, all standard operating procedures from his Special Forces days. When a student asked how he knew so much about handling the situation, Rick simply said, "I've spent time in places where you have to work with nature, not against it." He downplayed his extensive training in CBRN chemical, biological, radiological, nuclear, threats, and wilderness survival. By early evening, Rick had transformed their chaotic campsite into an organized response operation. The protected spaces were functioning, the affected students were stabilized, and they had established communication with emergency services via a signal booster Rick created using aluminum foil and a cooking pot, a communications trick from his days behind enemy lines. Looking at their improvised camp, Rick felt the same satisfaction he'd experienced leading successful missions. Different context, same principles. Adapt, overcome, protect the vulnerable. As dusk approached, the situation reached a critical point. Ellie, the student with the most severe reaction, began showing signs of respiratory distress despite the makeshift treatments. The satellite phone crackled with news that medical help was still at least 2 hours away. "She needs epinephrine," Rick stated, his face betraying no emotion, though he understood the gravity of the situation. The first aid kit in his truck contained an emergency EpiPen, but his vehicle was parked a quarter-mile away, with the densest part of the flies swarm between the camp and the parking area. "I'll get it," Rick said simply, reaching for a trash bag and duct tape. "Mr. Coleman, you can't go out there," Ms. Peterson protested. "The swarm is even worse now." Rick was already fashioning a protective hood. In Special Forces, we had a saying, "The only easy day was yesterday." It was the first direct reference he'd made to his military background. The students watched in awe as Rick transformed himself with makeshift protective gear. Trash bags sealed with duct tape over his clothing, a mesh head covering improvised from a strainer and bandana, hands and face coated with the pine resin mixture. "Monitor her breathing," he instructed Marcus. "If her lips turn blue, start rescue breathing." His calm demeanor masked the calculation happening in his mind, the risk assessment matrix he'd used countless times in combat. Rick stepped outside their protected area into the buzzing cloud. Drawing on breathing control techniques from his military training, he regulated his respiration to minimize fly inhalation. The swarm was disorienting, a living, moving mass that reduced visibility to mere feet. Using his internal compass and landmarks, Rick navigated through the worst of the swarm. Flies covered every inch of his protective gear, some finding ways inside despite his precautions. The stings and bites accumulated, but decades of pain tolerance training allowed him to compartmentalize the discomfort. Reaching his truck was only half the battle. With swollen fingers, he retrieved the medical kit and began the return journey. Halfway back, he encountered a new challenge. The rising stream had swelled further, cutting off his direct route. Without hesitation, Rick waded through the knee-deep water, protecting the precious EpiPen above his head. The current was stronger than expected, nearly sweeping his feet from under him, a dangerous situation for someone his age. But the functional strength maintained through years of post-military discipline held firm. When Rick finally emerged back into protected camp area, students and teachers alike stared in shock. His improvised suit was shredded in places, his exposed skin covered in bites, but in his hand was the intact medical kit. "Epinephrine," he said calmly, administering the injection to Ellie with the steady hands of someone who had performed emergency medicine under artillery fire. Within minutes, her breathing eased. "How did you even see where you were going?" one student asked in amazement. "You don't always need to see the path," Rick replied, wiping blood from a bite near his eye. "You just need to know it's there." 2 hours later, the whirring of helicopter blades announced the arrival of the emergency medical team. The fly swarm had begun to disperse as suddenly as it had appeared, likely responding to changing atmospheric conditions. The paramedics moved efficiently through the camp, checking each student. When they reached the makeshift medical area Rick had established, the lead paramedic stopped and surveyed the scene with professional appreciation. "Who set up this triage system?" she asked. "Mr. Coleman." Several students answered simultaneously. The paramedic examined Ellie, now breathing normally, and inspected Rick's improvised treatments. "Military?" she asked him quietly. "Lifetime ago," Rick nodded. "Green Beret medic, among other things." "Well, I've been doing this job 15 years, and I've never seen civilian first aid like this," she admitted. "Your actions likely saved this girl's life and prevented serious complications for the others." Rick shrugged, "Just applied the training." As the students were prepared for evacuation, parents began arriving at the trailhead, having heard about the incident through local news reports that described a massive insect swarm emergency at youth ecology camp. The story had already gone viral on social media. One father, upon learning what Rick had done, gripped his hand firmly. "My daughter said you walked through hell to get her friend medicine. I don't know how to thank you." "No thanks needed," Rick replied. Anyone with the same training would have done the same. But both knew that wasn't true. In the following days, local news interviewed students who described Rick's calm leadership in near mythical terms. The school principal announced that Rick had agreed to conduct emergency preparedness workshops for both students and faculty. As Rick drove home after declining yet another interview request, He reflected on how his military service continued to shape his life decades after retirement. The skills learned for war had saved lives and peace. The discipline forged in conflict had created calm in chaos. Perhaps that's a real mission, he thought, carrying what we've learned into a world that needs it. For those interested in supporting veterans' continued service to communities, Rick's story shows how military training creates lifelong responders. Have you encountered veterans using their skills in unexpected emergencies? Share your experiences in the comments.